Shalom and welcome to a new Talking Memory series, Grossaktion Warsaw, Remembering 80 Years Later, marking the 80th anniversary of the Great Deportation that began on July 22nd, 1942. My name is Medin Shachar, and I am a guide and educator at the Ghetto Fighters House. I want to welcome our global audience with a special welcome, as always, to the survivors and their families that are with us today. We want to thank everyone for their support and interest in our programs. This program and the whole series is in partnership with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Classrooms Without Borders, the Rabin Chair Forum, Moreshet Holocaust and Research Center in Israel, the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry at the University of Tel Aviv, the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv, and the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Before we start, I would like to send my condolences to Professor Hanna Jablonka and her family on the passing of her mother, Dr. Viola Torok. As the family is sitting Shiva, Yigal Cohen, CEO of the Ghetto Fighters House, will give the opening remarks instead of Professor Jablonka in a few minutes. Today's program, before the trains left the Umschlagplatz, with guest speaker Professor Havi Dreifuss and Holocaust survivor Pinchas Gutter, is the first in a four-part series that will take a look at the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto from different perspectives, and will explore the life of the Jewish community behind the walls of the ghetto during the summer of 1942, including the role of the Jewish police and the Jewish doctors in the ghetto, and the ways in which we remember and commemorate this tragic event. We hope that you will join us for all four programs. And now I would like to invite Yigal Cohen, CEO of the Ghetto Fighters House, to give the opening remarks. Yigal?
Shalom, everyone. I'm honored to open the first program of our new Talking Memory series, remembering the Great Deportation from Warsaw Ghetto, 80 years later. I would like to begin by sending our deep condolences to Professor Hanna Jablonka, the historian of the Ghetto Fighters House, on the passing of her beloved mother, Dr. Viola Torok. Viola was a Holocaust survivor from Czechoslovakia, who is a wonderful example of strength, revival, and the power of the human spirit. Her passing at the age of 107 years symbolizes the end of an era. May her memory be a blessing. I know you all join me in comforting Hannah and her family. The Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto began in July 1942. This was a turning point which led to the uprising that would take place 9 months later, a revolt which continues to inspire us today. The meaning of the deportation, the uprising which followed, and the commemoration of these events have been an integral part of the Ghetto Fighters House since its foundation. The hundreds of thousands of Jews that were sent to Treblinka death camp are commemorated at the Ghetto Fighters House every day, not only their immense hardships and crucial fate, but also their rich cultural lives before and during World War II. This series is dedicated to them, to their heroic thoughts and dedication, and most importantly, to the moral obligation that they left us to educate and pass their story on to future generations. I want to thank many partners who are collaborating with the Ghetto Fighters House in this prize-worthy lecture series. First of all, Professor Havi Dreifuss, a long-standing partner and friend of the house, for giving the opening lecture and for our continuing partnership. It is an honor to have Pinchas Gutter at this opening event, a child survivor. He and his family were confined in the Warsaw Ghetto for 2.5 years. Pinchas later survived 6 camps. Thank you, Pinchas, for sharing your testimony. I also want to thank the many institutions and organizations that are collaborating on this series. The Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Classroom Without Borders, the Rabin Chair Forum, Moreshet Holocaust and Research Center, the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry at the Tel Aviv University, the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv, and the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. A special thanks to Medin Shachar on her professional facilitation of our international virtual lecture series, Talking Memory. I wish all of us a fascinating and meaningful event. Thank you.
Thank you, Igal. Last week, I returned from a 12-day seminar in Poland. An emotional highlight was visiting one of our partners, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. It was a very moving experience for all participants, but for me, it was an opportunity to see the authentic documents that I have only seen translated in books and research papers. 2 of these documents represent for me the essence of the period leading up to the Great Deportation. On June 15th, 1942, 2 young couriers from the underground youth movement, Dror, Chavka Folman, who survived and was one of the founders of the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz, and Funka Plotniczka, who fell during the liquidation of the Benzin Ghetto in 1943, bring the first report of the Sobibor death camp to Warsaw. And this was written in Yiddish. In the lot by the station, across from us, parallel to the railway track, stretched a long wire fence, so that between the railway track and the fence, there was a large space filled tightly with Jews, men, women, children, some 5,000 people. There was noise, clamor, and a great anxiety. The peasants were talking among themselves that the Jews were being sent to certain death. A new Verge is in the making, Sobibor. And in his entry on Friday, June 26, 1942, Manuel Ringelblum believes that Onyx Shabbat has enlightened the world to the tragedy European Jewry has faced by the Nazis. He writes, Friday, June 26th, has been a great day for Onyx Shabbat. This morning, the English radio broadcast about the fate of Polish Jewry. They told about everything we know so well, about Slonim and Vilna, Lemberg and Chelmo. For long months, we had been suffering because the world was deaf and dumb to our unparalleled tragedy. But now, it seems that all our interventions have finally achieved their purpose. The Onyx Shabbat group has fulfilled a great historical mission. It has alarmed the world to our fate and perhaps saved hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews from extinction. And though Ringelblum is aware that the Jews are still in danger, he writes, if salvation comes soon, we are saved. This is the backdrop for this series as we follow in the footsteps of the Jewish community trapped behind the ghetto walls, filled with hope while brutally aware of their fate. And now I would like to introduce our key speaker, Professor Havi Dreifuss. Havi Dreifuss is Professor of Jewish History and head of the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry and Israel-Poland Relations at Tel Aviv University, as well as Director of the Center for Research on the Holocaust in Poland at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. Her research deals with various aspects of everyday life during the Holocaust, including the relationship between Jews and Poles, religious life in light of the Holocaust, and Jewish existence in the face of extermination. Her latest book, The Warsaw Ghetto, The End, April 1942, June 1943, won the Shazar Prize for the study of Jewish history, and soon, hopefully, will be published in English. Professor Dreifuss, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Medin. Thank you very much, Yigal and Tali and Nir and all the people involved in this area. As Yigal mentioned before, and as Medin mentioned before, I also want to dedicate this meeting. Sorry, I need to share my screen. I want to dedicate this Syria, in which I'll say a few words about in a second, to the blessed memory of Professor Hannah Jablonka's mother, Ibe Violatorek, who her actions during the Holocaust, as well as her part in building the medical world here in Israel after the war, is some kind of an aspiration for all of us. Though she was not Polish, I want to dedicate this lecture to her. And I was asked by our friends from Ghetto Fighters House to give the opening lecture to this area and to try to give the background to 3 topics that will be later on discussed: the Jewish police, Jewish doctors, and the way that Warsaw Ghetto is remembered and commemorated in ghetto diaries and in film. So what I'll try to do today in our meeting is to depict as much as I can those terrible months prior to the Great Deportation, as well as the Great Deportation itself. And here I must apologize and say that the content itself will not be easy one, but that goes, I guess, without saying when we refer to the Great Action of July 1942, 80 years ago. And if we would have had more time, I would have refer to the beginning of the occupation and to how Poland was divided. But we need to start with what happened, or to refer to what happened to Warsaw Jewry during the Second World War. And as in many other cases, numbers are very important. And here I want to remind us all that in the eve of the war, we had almost 380,000 Jews who lived in Warsaw, and they consisted almost 30% of its population. Now, to understand how important and huge this community was, especially when we compare it to other communities in the world, it was only the second after New York, one of the most important Jewish communities in the world. It had more than 3,000 Jews even in 1910, and you can see the percentage of the Jews is a little bit lowering during between the 20s and the 30s. The main reason is that Warsaw becomes larger and more neighborhood and areas are being considered as part of the city, as well as some immigration of Jews. But all of this is true prior to the war. What is happening at the beginning of the war is very, very, very important. Many times we run quickly to the ghetto, what we'll do here because of the topic. But during September 1939, during the campaign on Poland, more than 100,000 citizens, Poles and Jews of Warsaw left the city. About 20,000 were killed and about 50,000 were injured. Moreover, 25% of the houses within Warsaw were damaged, and some of them were totally destroyed. Actually, part of the houses which will later on be in the ghetto were totally destroyed during those months of the fight over Poland. Moreover, during those months, during those very first weeks, you can see that about 95,000 of the 175,000 Jewish breadwinners lost their earning capacity in the very first weeks of the occupations, because of the different decrees, because of the many people that fled from one place to another place, and of course with many more reasons, many Jews didn't have any way to earn living. And we can see that in September 28, 1939, we had almost 360,000 Jews in Warsaw. Not all of them are Jews who lived in Warsaw before that, which is a very important thing that we should bear in mind. Until November 1940, which will be when the ghetto will be established, we had more than 90,000 refugees, which means that when the ghetto will be established and later on, people will be deported into the ghetto. About a third of the population of the ghetto, about 150,000 of the ghetto Jews were refugees. Some of them were refugees from different parts of the Warsaw district. Others were deported from far away, even from Germany. But one of the important things that we should remember when we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto are those refugees. And whoever wants to read more about that, Leah Price wrote an excellent book. But this is important because when those refugees come, they not only make the situation even more problematic from the economical aspect and many others, but they bring with them the misery that we'll refer to it later on. The ghetto is being established in mid-November 1940, and please look at the numbers. About 380,000 Jews are being concentrated in an area which is about 3.5 square kilometers. That is between 3.5 to 4 square kilometers. That means that 30% of the city's population is limited in 2.4 of its territory. That means 73 streets only are the ghetto. In this zone, there are about 1,700 buildings, but not all of those buildings are buildings in which people can live. Only about 1,360 suitable residents, and those have less than 14,000 apartments. And you can make the calculation yourself, referring to how crowded this was. During March 1941, there were over 460,000 Jews. In the summer of 1941, about 450,000 Jews. At the end of 41, the numbers goes down because there are so many people who are being starved to death in the ghetto. We presume that about 80,000 Jews died in the ghetto because of its conditions prior to the Great Deportation that we'll refer to it later. And in the summer of 1942, the time that we will refer today, about 380,000 Jews lived in the ghetto, meaning that 26% of the city population were squeezed into about 2.65 square kilometers, which is less than 2% of the area of the city. I'm saying all those numbers because these can explain how difficult the situation in the Warsaw Ghetto was. And what you can see here is a map of the ghetto prior to the Great Deportation, but actually when the ghetto was established, its borders were a little bit different. Its borders were those that you can see here, and you can see those blue zones and those grays and those green zones. Those zones are important because first of all, you can see that the border of the ghetto, when it was established, the Germans tried to maximize or to minimize the institutions, the Polish institution that will be stuck in the ghetto. So you can see how it's almost a maze of those streets, of those borders. Later on, when the Germans understood that that is too problematic, they squeezed the ghetto and took off all those blue areas that you can see here. And they had another problem that we'll refer to it slightly maybe later, and that is a problem of smuggling. We know today that about 80% of the food that people ate in the ghetto came from those smugglings. Since the Germans knew that that is a big problem, they moved the border from the middle of buildings into the middle of the streets, understanding that when the border of the ghetto is between buildings, one can just break holes in the walls of the building and smuggle in food. And this is why the borders were changed. But not less important is that we can see really how those buildings were in the Warsaw area. And we can see, first of all, areas that were completely destroyed during the campaign of September 1939. We can also see, some houses. When I'm talking about a house in Warsaw, it's not like a house in Israel or a house in the United States. It's a complex in which you can see a one yard within another yard within another yard. And actually, the house here in Alewski 42 is one of the largest houses in the ghetto, with 4 courts, one entering the other. Now, one of the interesting things is that we don't have only those maps. Another thing that we have, and I'm sorry, it should have been shared in an easier way. I apologize for a second. We have today the ability to use not only those maps, but also aerial photos. And what you can see here is, of course, Google Earth, which each and every one of you can use. And you have this ability to choose different aerial photos. This one is from 1935. And you can see here the area in which later on the ghetto will be established. This is what will be the Umschlagplatz. This is the main Polish train station. And in between, you can see those Jewish streets that we could see before. This is Moranovska-Platz. This is this is Nalewki. This is Zamenhof. But more interesting, or at least not less interesting, is that we can jump to year 1945 and see how all this area was destroyed during the uprising that we won't be able to refer to here, but of course is important. If I'll go back to year 1935, you can see those courts I referred to. You can see how this is a main street, Nalewki, and here there is one house and there another court and another court and so on. This will be very important when we'll talk about the action, the Great Deportation of July 1942. But I'm showing all those maps just to understand how, what is this ghetto that we are talking about. And when we're coming to the mid of 1942, the ghetto has new borders. Those are this green line that you can see here. Don't refer to the different colors, which are more relevant to the time of the uprising. And within this area, which is divided between the small ghetto and the large ghetto, this is where those Jews are being confined. Now, we could refer to different aspects of the ghetto. We could refer to the starvation and to the amount of money, amount of food allocated to the Jews. We could refer to the many different aid projects which are be done in the ghetto, some by the Judenrat, others by different organizations. And the Oneg Shabbat was mentioned before. I should mention here that Emanuel Ringelblum was involved not only in documenting what is happening in the ghetto, but also in the Jewish self-help, in the joint and in other emphasized to help as much as one can the great distress in which the Jews were. We could refer to the fact that despite the starvation, despite the crowdness, despite the fear of the Germans, there are many cultural events. And you can see this orchestra of children, and you can see different theaters shows. This little note that you can see here is an invitation to a play in Janusz Korczak House of Orphans, which was sent to Antek Yitzhak Katzenelson, and it was only 4 days before the Great Deportation started. That was on the 18th of July, 1942, and the invitation itself cites a poem of Vladislav Schlengel, who is another poet active in the ghetto. So we have this great distress, and we have cultural events, we have political activities, underground newspapers. And if we had more times, we could refer to the different youth movements and political organizations and how they try to be active in the ghetto. And we could refer to the many different people who wrote diaries and other documents in the ghetto, trying to document what is happening to the Jewish world. But since our time is short and we have to refer to the days before the Great Deportation and the Great Deportation itself, I want to refer only to a few topics. One of them is, of course, the Jewish police, which you'll later on hear. We have to remember that the Jewish police was established actually even before the establishment of the ghetto. As soon as the Jews are being separated and the walls that are separating what will be the Warsaw Ghetto from the other part of the ghetto are being built even before the Warsaw Ghetto is being established. But as soon as the Jews are being separated from the police society, there is a need for a Jewish organization to make sure that many things will be done as they should. That is curfew hours, that is the court should be clean, and that is that people will pay taxes and many other things. As times go on, the duties of this force, of this Jewish police, are changing, and you will hear what is happening to them during the Great Deportation. But just to understand how difficult their duty was before the Great Deportation and how they saw themselves, I just want to cite one document or one expert from Stanislav Gombinsky's diary, and he wrote the following. What punishment could be imposed on a person who tears hats off children's heads and takes it away, or something of a higher degree of expertise, of a chaper that leads a child to some stairwell and strip him from his clothes? What punishment should be imposed on a craftsman who does not pay anything to his assistants? Or what of that who takes advantage of the helplessness and does not pay rent. How to deal with an uncle or aunt who take over the belongings left by their deceased brother and is not interested in the orphans the deceased left behind. And I'm giving this example just that we will remember that when we will discuss the Jewish police during the Great Deportation, we should remember that prior to that, for months and actually for years, they had to do other things that have never been part of the duties of the Jewish community. And one of the problems that if we would have had more times, we could discuss, and you can see this is part of the visual documentation, a very important topic that we refer today, you can see their uniforms. And you can see that those uniforms, they are not, of course, identical, God forbid, to the Germans one, but the fact that you have Jews in the ghetto with those boots and with those clothes who are standing many times near the Germans, they already have quite a problematic image even before the Great Deportation starts. The story of the Jewish doctors, of course, is a total different one. And I already mentioned the starvation, and I already mentioned how problematic it was for Jews just to survive there. And one of the heartbreaking things is to see how the medical system itself was enlisted to assist those people. Whoever is more interested about it, I'll refer him or her to the excellent book written by Miriam Ofer. And one of the most interesting things to see is not only that they take care of those people in the ghetto, those doctors understand that they are in unprecedented times. And one of the things that they're doing medical research parallel to taking care of people, parallel to having even a medical school in the ghetto. They are doing a medical research, a hunger research, trying to understand for future generations how problematic are the effects of the hungers in the ghetto. And the man who leads it is a man I'm sure you'll refer to it when time comes to talk about the Jewish doctors. That is Dr. Israel Milikovsky, who will write later the unfinished, meaningful symphony written by Jewish doctors in 1942. And this is what he writes. I have never been sized, and this is what he writes after the Great Deportation, when he and his colleagues had to stop doing what they have done until then. I have never been sized with such feeling of anger as at this moment when I come to write the opening to this document. I take the pen in my hand, and death is watching me from all sides. The work presented here is unfinished. It was halted suddenly on July 1942. In the history of Warsaw, we can distinguish between two periods, one until July 22, 1942, and the other period after that date. The first period is marked by general famine, and this is what he and his friends was working on. The second by widespread death, which is sending those Jews to Treblinka. It is no wonder that all scientific work regarding the famine was stopped in the second period. They destroyed the hospitals, they destroyed the laboratories, and the most important thing, they destroyed the material of our work. They destroyed human beings. And I'm citing this to just emphasize what Yigal said before. The Great Deportation is a watershed in the history of the Warsaw Ghetto Jews, and nothing continued as it was before. Cultural work, religious life, political activities, family ties, anything that we think of when we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto changed with the beginning of the Great Deportation. Now, to understand the Great Deportation, we of course need to go to something that I hope, I heard few testimonies of Pinchas, and we'll have the honor to hear him. And again, I don't know if he wants to refer to it or not, but one of the main questions is, what did Jews think or feel before the Great Action, before the Grossaktion started? And one of the interesting things is that we have in Ringelblum archive many documents which reflect what happened in the ghetto. And one of the things are many postcards sent to those refugees I mentioned before in the ghetto, The third of the population in the ghetto are refugees, and they're getting postcards from little communities. For example, Rabbi Silman from Grabov is writing to his relative in Warsaw Ghetto on the 21st of January, 1942. Dear beloved one, now we can tell you about the terrible events that happened close to us, to our town, something that has remained a top secret to this day. For your information, 4 weeks ago, they expelled all the Jews without exception from the town of Kowo, men, women, and children, and trucks took them to an unknown destination. And then he says that now we know where they were taken. They were taken to Chelmno. He explained exactly what is going there. And he says, what has been kept a secret until this day must be published. You must raise a voice of cry, neither rest nor silent. Think of the advice and deception on how to save the remains from this terrible decree, may God forbid. Okay, so we have those Jews, and actually one of the important things is that parallel to the network of information of those youth movements that were mentioned by Medin, we have networks of rabbis who are passing this information, and this information comes to the ghetto. I'll give you another example. Again, this is a religious source, religious because it's written in Yiddish, but with many Hebrew words. For example, an anonymous man from Vladova Ghetto writes on June 1st, 1942, and whoever wants to read more about this letter can find it in David Zilberkalang's book, A Gate with Our Tears. We are, thanks God, healthy. This man writes to his family members in Warsaw. But since the uncle wants to have his children's party by you, God forbid, because he's renting an apartment very near to you, okay? Vladova near Sobibor, there was this apartment near us, and now I'm trying to warn the family members who are in Warsaw. You may not even know about it. That's why I'm writing you now, and we are sending you this information, especially so you should know. He has already prepared a new apartment for everyone, the same one he had near us. You must do everything to be in the apartment that is in hiding, so that you will not end with Shlomo Velvel of blessed memory. Now, we don't know what happened to Shlomo Velvel, but whoever got this letter knew what happened to Shlomo Velvel. The only good fortune is that of he who sits secretly. Remember well that we are holy, and which is left until morning, etc. You can see here, Gedent gut, azmir zenen kdoshim, ve'anotar mimeno ad haboker v'chu. The end of this phrase will be burned totally. Okay? So you can see here in this letter how he's trying to pass information in a way that the Germans cannot understand, even if they read it, to warn his family relatives who are in the Warsaw Ghetto. And those are not the only examples. I'll give two last one. One of them is of Roja Kaplan, who is writing her husband. He's in the Warsaw Ghetto. She's in a small ghetto with the two children, and she's writing, now everything is shaking beneath me. At this moment, I spoke to someone who came from Chelmno. The same thing that happened to the aunt from Kalish is happening to them. That is not a lie. Now, we don't know what happened to this aunt from Kalish, but her husbands know that for sure. That is one thing. Another thing is that she writes to her husband, I want to flee and come to you with our children, but it's winter now. And if I'll flee now, the children will freeze. And if I won't flee, I don't know what will happen to us. And we can see those rumors are entering into the ghetto. And the question is, what is their impact before the Great Deportation? What do people understand from them? So one example can be taken from Reichenitsky, who later became a very famous critic, literature critic in Germany. And he writes in March 1942, I first heard that somewhere in Poland, Jews were put in small rooms and the German killed them by gas of car. I did not believe, and I didn't know anyone who thought it was possible. Okay, so trying to understand this unprecedented information, murderous information, is very, very difficult, although there are people who did believe. For example, and this is from Hirschwasser diary. Hirschwasser was one of the members of Ringelblum Archive, and he writes at the end of May 1942, it is typical that the Warsaw Jews are calmer than the provincial Jews. Most of them provincial Jews are the refugees. Most of them who are from the Verge, that are the western parts of Poland, who are next to Germany, and Lublin district, the last remnants. They later in particular are beside themselves. They see death before their eyes. They don't believe this assurance, which resemble for them to those of which were ended in death, whether in Chelmno or in Belzec. And he even adds and said, I'm sorry, I thought I added here his last two lines, in which he says, Dr. Emanuel, he refers to Emanuel Ringelblum, presume that those who are be taken now are taken for work. Now, it's true that those Jews who were taken on May 1942 from the Warsaw Ghetto were sent to work, but bad things were awaiting to other Jews in Warsaw. And understanding and trying to understand what it was to live in the days before that, one of the, I think the expert of the diaries, which reflect it more than others, is what another member of Ringelblum Archive wrote. And this is Avraham Levin with his daughter, Ora. And he wrote, we did not know if there is a basis for the fear of the Jews of Warsaw, but it is difficult, very difficult, to live in constant terror. And this constant terror is one thing that was typical to the life in Warsaw prior to the Great Deportation, despite the fact that many Jews still believe that it won't happen in Warsaw. It won't happen in Warsaw because Warsaw is so large. You can maybe deport Jews from a small community, but you cannot send hundreds of thousands of Jews. It will not happen to Warsaw because Warsaw is the capital of the city. And there are so many people who are working here in different factories of the Germans, Shop or Platzówkon. And it won't happen here because so many refugees were concentrated in this ghetto. If the Germans would have wanted to kill them, they would have killed them somewhere else. There's no reason in putting them here in the Warsaw Ghetto and then sending them away. So it won't happen in Warsaw. And those things that happened so far away, it could be because of those Jews who were communist or because those areas were annexed to the Reich. It won't happen to us. It won't happen to the Warsaw Jews. And actually, when the Great Deportation will start, and here I go back to those days of the Great Deportation of July 22nd to September 21st, 1942, the Warsaw Jews will unfortunately very soon understand that everything that they heard is only a shade of the horror that they are facing. Between those two dates, about 300,000 men, women, and children were sent to Treblinka. That means that in 2 months, the ghetto is changing its face from a ghetto in which hundreds of thousands of Jews were living, less than 50,000 Jews remained. The ghetto borders will change, and all the pink side that you can see here will be returned to the Aryan side. The only area that will remain is the northern part of the ghetto. And Kaplan wrote about those days. The terrible events have floated me. I do not have the words to express what we're going through since the deportation was declared. With one stroke of pen, the face of Warsaw was changed. They made an end of its peddlers, its beggars and paupers, and down and outers were collected. Its stores were closed, its streets were emptied. Everywhere there is a silence of graveyard. And what I want to do in about the 10 minutes I have left is try to describe to you the horror of the Great Deportation, because without that, we won't be able to understand the later discussions in this area. First of all, I want you to look at this chart in which you can see the reasons of death, the causes of mortality among Warsaw Jews during the Great Aktion. So you can see that the people are being shot, and you can see that there are people who are committing suicide, that is the blue color, but you can see that in the beginning, the more Jews were starving to death than being shot. And you can see even that there are 2 days that nobody writes any data. This data is from Ringelblum Archive personnel, who in the beginning did not write numbers during the Shabbos. The Great Deportation started on Wednesday, and in the beginning they still were tracking the days, and they didn't write on Shabbat. But later on, people did not realize what day it is. In the beginning, they didn't think they need to write about those people who are committing suicide. It wasn't something in the society, Jewish society prior to that. But you can see from those numbers, part of the tragedy of the Jews, as Gusta Jerecka wrote, and she's another member of Ringelbaum Archive, official statistics and public notice are testimony segments from the new settlement period of the Jewish quarter in Warsaw in July 1942. Written remarks can only add some details about certain events or special cases, but nothing is convincing as the numbers themselves. I write down the numbers and they depict the picture of streets that once were and are gone forever, of people who have perished, of unbelievable events that are recorded for the purpose of providing the writer herself that they have actually did happen. And I want to refer to a few aspects. First of all, the way that the Germans are doing those actions. Here you can see the official announcement of the Great Deportation. And in the beginning, the Germans said, and we won't read everything, that there will be a resettlement. And there are many groups who are being excluded from this settlement. Jews who are employed by German authorities, or members of the Judenrat, and people who work in German Reich companies, or Jews who can work, or people who work in hospitals, and the Blue Police, and the Jewish police, and people who are relative to those Jews, and people who are hospitalized, and all of those people should not be sent. Others should take 5 kilograms and should be ready to be deported away. Now, this is important because one of the things that the Germans are doing is that they are breaking the Jewish society. This is what Dr. Ignaz Schipper from Polation Left wrote, said after he heard about this Great Deportation. There are times when a people cannot and does not need to fight. Under those conditions, if we declare war, we might lose everything that could have been saved. It is better to accept that 70,000 Jews will go to Treblinka so that 6,000 Jews won't go. We need to save what can be saved, even if we were to know that those who live go to their death. The Jewish society thought that it's only a small part of those people that will be deported, and he was not the only one. This is what Rabbi Friedman said. Rabbi Zushon Friedman had emphasized the divine providence, saying, I believe in God and in miracles. God will not permit the decimation of Israel, his people. We must wait, and the miracle will come. So when we talk about what is happening to the society, the fact that the Germans are misleading the Jewish society, thinking that some could save themselves, is actually breaking the Jewish society. And we can see here a quick process of atomization. If we would have had more time, which we don't, we could refer to the fact that Judenrats in many other places many times disobeyed in the beginning the Germans' orders, and only later on, when they understood that those who disobey are cruelly murdered, those head of the communities, those Judenrats started to obey the Germans' orders. But in this sense, I cannot elaborate. Maybe you will discuss it later on when we refer to the Jewish police. I'll just cite Hannah Arendt, who said, when one is faced with the choice of betraying his friends and thus causing their murder, or sending his wife and children to their death, from whom he is totally responsible, when even suicide means the immediate murder of the nearest family, how can one decide? The choice is again not between good and evil, but between murder and murder. And I think these choiceless choices that we can see here from taking Langer's term, we can see the tragedy of the Jewish people, and this is only the beginning. I want to refer to an important aspect of the Great Deportation, and that is a blockade. What is a blockade? How is a deportation being done? And I'll give you just one example. We could give many other description of that, but this is how a Jewish policeman, Stanislav Schnatman, explains how it goes, okay? German with Ukrainian Jewish policemen surrounded a block of houses. The Jewish police went from house to house, calling everyone to concentrate in one place. They warned those who would not come forward that they will be subjected to death penalty. The Germans and Ukrainians scream and shout to scare and create panic. Pale, fronted, crying people run to the street, and there they identify themselves as workers for the Germans, but to no avail. Men, women, young and old, and even children are being beaten. At the same time, Ukraine and Germany, accompanied by the Jewish police, search their apartment room by room. Those who come later or were found in hiding places are killed on spot. People come out, usually undressed. Older people, children, and sick people lying in bed were murdered on the spot. Door locks were broken. Those hiding were killed immediately and their houses looted. And in the street, amidst beating and shots, people were lined up, crying women, children wailing loudly, and those voices mingled with sounds of weeping, shots, shouting, cursing, and mocking, hell in all its essence. And to maximize the oppression, they commanded the victim to fall down, get up, and kneel for many hours. And when they evacuated the Jews, they surrounded them and led them to the central square. Wherever the German passed, pools of Jewish blood remained, and several dozens of corpses of men, women, children, and old people, innocent victims of the German cultural nation. Those who hide in attics, basement, and other hiding places were saved temporarily until the next action. Now, I want to put a parallel to this description, a description of a woman who describes what is an action, what is a blockada. And this is a diary taken from the diary of Mira Pijitz, who described what happened to her family during the Great Deportation. And she says the following: we pass in front of the Jewish police officer, it's our turn, and we present our certificates. Okay, all the family is working. Behind us is my grandparents' maid. She has worked for them for 30 years, and we treat her as a family member. She's ready to go through fire and water for us, and we too are very committed to her. It goes without saying that when we arrange employment certificates for ourselves, we also arrange certificates for her. She received an employment certificate at Hellman's company. She can't read, but we stuck the certificate contact in her head for days. Freida must remember, Freida works as a cook at Hellman's company. It is a furniture company. Freida cooked for the workers there. There is in the Novolipki Street. I know well, she was her constant answer, always the same one. Hellman company, I cook for the ones who make furniture. In Novolipki, that's it. She promised us that she won't forget. When it was her turn, she pulled out the certificate and immediately said, everything I do is in here. The officer gave a small smile. Well, then tell me, ma'am, what are you doing? The poor thing turned pale as lime, chucked at my sleeve. Mirka, tell them, I don't know everything. Mirale, tell them, I make furniture at Hellman. It's somewhere I don't know. The officer did not say a word, just pointed with his hand to the group of people standing at the gate of the court. My heart froze. I looked at Freida. She was pale as snow. My grandparents' eyes filled with tears. My little sister and my 6-year-old cousin cried terribly. We started to ask that Freida will be released. We tried to justify it with money, all in vain. He couldn't let her go. I understand him well. Gentleman justified himself. There is no way I can do it, even if I wanted. Please understood, I have to feel it the way daily quota. Otherwise, hostage will pay with our heads. I have to take someone, and it's better to lose such a woman, not young and ignorant, and someone from the intelligentsia. There's no choice. We begged him again with tearful eyes, nothing helped. The pale Freda, bathed with tears, was loaded into a cart. She shouted loudly. I was standing next to the cart. I comforted her with that we would see each other again, but tears choked my throat, and my reason certainly didn't sound very convincing. The poor thing understood that her path was leading to destruction. Each of us would have felt himself in such a situation, abandoned and defenseless. And she, who from her youth has gotten used to follow orders without thinking of herself to do anything, all the more. She was as a little girl. The cart moved, and in my ears, her voice rang endlessly. Mirale, and you gave me away? Now, since we have to, I need to start and summarize. I will just mention a few more things, 2 more minutes, Maiden, I'm sorry. First of all is that we can see during the Great Deportation how people are sacrificing themselves to go with their families, meaning that this is a lose-lose situation. People who will follow their families to the Umschlagplatz will be murdered. And those who will stay behind will feel for years that they have abandoned their beloved one. If we had more times, I could refer to the great cruelty in which those deportations are being done. But just to show you one last thing is those numbers, I won't read anymore. Those numbers that you can see here, this is the official sentence I mentioned before. Those are the numbers before the Great Deportation and after them. Before the Great Deportation, about 50,000 children less than 9 years old lived in the ghetto. After the Great Deportation, 250. There was, before the Great Deportation, 70,000 youth. After the Great Deportation, less than 2,500. And the destructiveness is not only of the society of people. Yitzhak Katzenelson in year 1938, Yitzhak Katzenelson in year 1942. Thus, what we're trying to show now is here during the Great Deportation is, first of all, the total change of the Jewish life, the crushing of the Jewish society, the unnecessary violence, and the fact that all of this is part of the final solution. Later on, you'll hear more details about part of those horrific time in the Warsaw Ghetto.
First of all, Havi, thank you so much for giving us this background. I think it really is an important first step in understanding the rest of the programs as we continue on. And once again, it was fascinating. I say you could have had another 5 minutes and we would have been fine, but thank you again. There were a few questions. Take a look in the chat as we turn to Pinchas, because I do want to give him time to talk now. And I hope we will have a few minutes at the very end to answer a few of the questions that are in our chat box. But now I would like to turn to our next speaker. And first of all, I want to say that we are truly, truly honored to have Pinchas Gutter with us today. And I want to say that he and other survivors, as well as the Jewish community that was annihilated, that we heard about now through Havi's presentation, and did not survive, these are the people that inspire me to do these programs. So let me give a very short introduction about Pinchas. I won't go into detail because he will be talking with us about his experiences in the Warsaw Ghetto. But Pinchas is a survivor of 6 German Nazi concentration camps, and he presently lives in Toronto, Canada. He was born in Verge and was 8 years old when the war started. Pinchas, along with his parents Menachem and Chaya and twin sister Sabina, fled to Warsaw, where they were confined in the Warsaw Ghetto for 2.5 years. We've invited Pinchas to share with our audience today his experiences in the ghetto. And before I turn the floor to Pinchas, I just want to say that I will be putting some information about Pinchas in our chat box. First of all, his story is in a film called Political Polish Jew, the story of Pinchas Gutter. Also a book that he wrote, Memories in Focus. I will put a link to that as well. And just so everyone knows that Pinchas was actually the first inaugural participant in the USC Shoah Foundation's Dimensions in Testimony project. And you can see the hologram Pinchas in the internet today. And his full testimony is available at the Shoah Foundation website. So at this point, I want to give the floor to Pinchas. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the listeners that are here. And before I even start saying anything, I just want to mention something, and that is, having listened to Professor Havi Dreifuss, she gave such it's difficult for me even to explain. It was so vivid that I was actually shivering and shaking inside me when she was giving all those information about the Warsaw Ghetto. I just want to add a little bit to my own experiences, and I will tell you a little bit about myself. We were born in Verge, and we lived in Verge. And my first experience of meeting the Nazis was when they came to arrest my grandfather. And I can't tell you the whole story because we don't have the time. But the fact is, they took my father to we were winemakers, they took him down to the cellars, they beat him so badly, and they left him for dead. They destroyed the winery, and for 2 days they were busy there. And then eventually they left, and the caretaker, a Polish Christian Catholic, risked his life and found my father, who was still alive, and put him on his shoulder, brought him back to our home. When the war ended, the Nazis occupied the whole of Poland and the Russians did the other thing. We were blonde and blue-eyed. My mother and my sister and my twin sister, we were all blonde and blue-eyed. So my father decided that we should go to Warsaw to stay with our aunt who lived in Warsaw. And because Warsaw was occupied, general government occupied Poland. And so we went by train as Christians, and we had no problems. We went it was round about end of November or middle of December, we went to Warsaw. My father, it took him quite a long time to smuggle himself, because there was a border between Wartegau, which was became part of Germany. Łódź then became part of Wartegau, and they are included it into the German Reich as a province of the German Reich. It took him about 2.5 months. He walked all the way, and eventually he came. And when he came, he was a winemaker, and we were living 17 people in my aunt's place in the Elektralna number 14. I even remember the names of all these things. And he then went to look for a place for us to live. And fortunately at the time, he found a place in Nalewki number 49, where the front of the building was destroyed. The Polish buildings in Warsaw were quadrangles with a courtyard inside. And so the front was destroyed, but the rest of the building stayed. It was the corner of Mila and Nalewki, actually. The corner of Mila and Nalewki, which afterwards played a big role in my little story. He was a winemaker. He had to make a living. So my father started buying raisins. We had a tiny little apartment. I mean, the apartment that we actually found, where all the utilities were in the courtyard, in the hallway, was a little bedroom where the 4 of us slept, and a little kitchen. And at night, I'm kind of giving forward, when the ghetto was closed, my father used to bring people to sleep. We didn't even have more allocated people because it was so small. But he set up a winery there. And this was before the ghetto was closed. And my mother started selling cigarettes and sweets in front of a little kind of kiosk, also in Nalewki Street. And this is all before the ghetto. We didn't even know. First they said there was going to be a ghetto, and then wasn't going to be a ghetto. And in October, they started actually building the walls of the ghetto. And my father used me. I had a rucksack. And on Fridays, he would give me the bottles of wine, which I would run around collecting from cafes and things like that. I'm going very fast because I haven't got the time to tell you my whole story. And then I would, people still had money, and this is all before the ghetto started. And then they would give me the money, and I would give them a bottle of wine. And then I went around collecting bottles from all the cafes. These were Polish cafes. I was blonde, I was blue-eyed, I was running around with my hair, without a hat, without, of course, a yarmulke, and nobody, and I spoke absolute pure Polish because my grandfather was a farmer, and we spent a lot of time on his farm before the war with all the Polish people and others, and I spent time in the mountains when I was sick. So we were all pure Polish speaking. So I could get away with it. Then when the ghetto closed, my father continued making wine, and my mother then couldn't find any more on the black market. She couldn't compete in the black market. So she started making little challahs. My father would buy flour on the black market, and she would make little challahs, and I started developing that. Now, when the ghetto was closed, anything that Professor Dreifuss told you, despite the fact that we had all the different things that they didn't allow us to do, we did. For example, my father found a melamed, and he had a little cellar, and there were 7 or 8 boys there, and we studied the Gemara Nedurim mitten Ran, one of the most difficult part of the Talmud. And as long as my father could afford it, I used to go there. And then I used to run around to Jewish cafes. There were a lot of Jewish cafes where collaborators, cooperators, the Polish blue police, the Jewish police, the Nazis were sitting, inside. They were dancing. They were, geese was the big thing in Poland, that they were roasting geese, and I could stand outside and smell the taste of these geese. And then next to the cafe, there were dead bodies lying. From beginning of 1941, you couldn't go into the streets. Once from when you got out from your place in the morning, there were dead bodies everywhere. So much so that I saw a scene which I've never forgotten. And that is, one day, the Jewish, originally the Jewish Burial Society, they will go in wooden carts and collect the bodies like you collect rubbish. But there were so many bodies lying around, and that was like in the middle of 1941, that the Jewish police caught men and anybody, and they gave them wheelbarrows to collect the bodies. And they would go down, they dug a huge pit in the Jewish cemetery, which you can go there today and you'll see a monument above it. And where, as Professor Dreifuss, and I believe that between close to 100,000 people actually are buried there. And they would just take them, no prayers, no nothing. And this little boy who couldn't stand at home, because I was never scared. For some reason, I was never scared. And I still delivered, to those people who could afford it. There were a lot of Jews who could, in the ghetto, until the deportation started, who could still afford it. My father's wine and my mother's little challahs was well known, and I would go with addresses and I would deliver it. And I would see scenes like Germans in open cars. You cannot imagine what kind of an apocalyptic hell the Warsaw Ghetto was. German officers on leave, maybe not Gestapo, not nothing, they were on leave, trying to enjoy themselves. They would come and look at the ghetto with their girlfriends, and they would take out their revolvers and they would shoot at people like you hunt dogs or you hunt animals. And sometimes they would kill them, sometimes they would wound them, and sometimes they would miss them. But this little boy saw all these scenes before the deportations. So we didn't have a problem moving into the ghetto because we were already living in Nalewki 1949, which was part of the ghetto. And as Professor Dreifuss told you, Nalewki was one of the most important kind of streets in the Warsaw Ghetto. And lots of things were happening there. And I find it really incredible that in such iniquity, there was so much goodness, the self-help society, the doctors, the everything that you can think of. When I got sick in the Warsaw Ghetto because I had weak lungs, because I had pneumonia before the war, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story about what happened to me before the war. But a doctor came to our little apartment and tried to help me, and they bought horse meat to make a soup for me to strengthen me, and I wouldn't eat it because I was a Gerre Chassid, and my father was a man with a beard, and the son of the Reb Chemiele, the Gerre Rebbe's brother, who he left to look after his flock, was living next to us, also in the same building. But they forced me to eat that. So the thing is, and my parents, the way they cared for the two children. My sister never went out, but I always was running in the streets, and I saw all those hundreds of thousands of scenes of both goodness and terrifying things. And they all stuck in my mind. You know, with today's technology, one day maybe they'll be able to, you know, if I could actually put on a screen what I see with my eyes at the moment, you know, you can project it. I could actually project it. Maybe one day you could project your brain onto a screen. Maybe they'll get to it. I don't know. It's possible. And then on the 22nd, this thing was going on, you know, all the time. People, I mean, one of my uncles died, and they still had enough money to bribe the burial society because he was a great Hasid and a great kind of part of the Jewish German Hasidim. They managed to take him to the cemetery and bury him properly. I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral, but my father managed to go, you know, and because there was I mean, I'm not going to tell you the whole story of the cemetery because it was just outside of the ghetto, and there was police and all kinds of stuff like that. But then on the 22nd of July, these placards appeared on the walls. And as Professor Dreifuss told you, we didn't know what was going on, especially a little boy. All I know is that as soon as these placards came up on the walls, my father, maybe because of his experiences that he was so badly beaten, didn't trust the Germans at all. And we were always hidden right from the beginning, in despite the fact that we had a cousin who was a very, very brave and fantastic individual who actually brought us all the necessary documents for being able to go out. But my father didn't trust them, because when you went down with the documents, they had different documents. One day it was red, one day it was gray, one was green, and they would say everybody must come down to show the documents. And when you showed the document, they would say, these documents are not valid anymore. Then the Jewish police was very active in the time I'm talking about, from July to September. And I also remember this cousin, his wife and daughter, who was 4 years younger than me, he sent them out to friends, Aryan, on the Aryan side, to the Christian side, to hide. And he came to our little apartment at the time when there was a little lull. And he said, you know, you are, my mother was blonde and we were blonde and blue-eyed. He said, look, I can take you and I can take your daughter. And my mother refused. She wouldn't go. And, you know, I didn't know anything about what was going on at that time. But soon I learned that, you know, people are being sent to death. And I also observed all these terrible things. And I'll tell you one thing. It was Yom Kippur. So it was already towards the end of the Great Deportation. And we were hidden all the time. My father always found places for us to hide. My mother, my sister, and I were always hidden. And we never ever went down to any inspection, and we never ever went down. My father was a very timid man. And during the war, he became like a giant. And he did everything to save his family. So we were in an attic, and we were praying. It was Yom Kippur. And my father took the talus and put it over me and hugged me close to him. And then I ran away, and because we were in the roof, and there were splits in the wooden kind of, it was a roof where there were splits in the wood. And we were hidden in this attic behind false walls, very well organized. And I looked through the splits because I just couldn't stand with my father holding me. And I ran out and I looked through the splits. And what did I see? I saw Ukrainians and Germans killing people, running, shaking them. And then the Jewish police was still completely active and working. They were stacking up these people like logs of wood. And then there were always lulls. And then there was a lull. And then there was another deportation in the beginning of January, when they came in. By that time, there was an organization that were fighting against, and some of the Jewish police were being assassinated, and all kinds of things were happening in the Warsaw Ghetto, which didn't happen. We did have there were only a few. There were maybe, I believed at the time that there were about 1,000. And what's even more interesting is that we started digging bunkers underneath the ruins of the Nalewki 49 and corner of Mila and Nalewki. They built a huge bunker for 150 people approximately, put in water, put in electricity, put in air vents in the ruins so that you should have air inside. And if there was any deportation, we would run and hide in there. And then Erev Pesach, when the big revolt started, they came to take the rest of us. There were still about 50 or 60,000. I don't know exactly. You know, the numbers are not quite clear. And people still worked at the turbans factory, at the other factories. So originally there were still things. And during the lull, people did things other than, you know, you try to live a little bit. And my father still made some wine. Where he found the raisins, I have no idea. And I used to run around the streets when there was a lull. I wasn't scared. And I saw, and all the buildings were empty. All these apartments, you could go in and you could help yourself. There was actually watches and gold lying around, and the Germans didn't get the chance yet to collect everything, didn't get Jews to go and do it because it was just in the middle. They would go away for a few days. We thought it was the end, and they went to Otfots to take people away. So I ran around, and what I found a book, and I found empty torches, you know, electric torches without the bulbs and without batteries. And I started collecting them in a little suitcase. And the book had no fly leaf, and so I didn't know the name of it, and it didn't have that complete ending. A few pages were missing. But on top of each page, it was a Polish book, was written Scarlet O'Hara. And I kept on reading that book. And this is what I was doing in between the times. Then came the 19th of July, 19th of April of 1943. And we were still in the ghetto. And we were still in our little apartment. And the phones were working. And somehow at 5 o'clock in the morning, my mother woke us up. And I want to tell you a mother's love. She put 2 pairs of raituzi. Raituzi are stocky, kind of pantyhose, like, you know, woolen pantyhose, because we were going down to the cellar. And she was scared that her children are going to get cold in that cellar, in that bunker. So she put 2 pairs of us. And then we went down to the bunker. And then my father took some bottles of wine, and the baker, they used to bake bread for the factories, for the German factories that people were still working officially. He must have baked some matzahs, and we went down and we stayed and we went down to the bunker. And that evening, despite everything that was happening, despite the shooting and the killing and the suffering of the few years, we celebrated the Seder. We only had some matzahs, we only had a little bit of wine, but we celebrated the Seder with crying and asking for deliverance. 150 people. There was an entrance in Mila 3, in Mila number 3, there was an entrance with a trapdoor and this. We stayed in that bunker for about almost 3 weeks. In the first week of May, we were discovered and we were taken out to the Umschlagplatz. But when we came out, I still remember my emotions and feelings. The Germans, you know, with parachutes, they're like parachuters, with their guns, their automatic guns across their chests and dressed in helmets and everything. And they kept on shouting, Hände hoch, nicht schießen, Hände hoch, nicht schießen. And this little boy was so proud. They're scared of us. They're scared of us. And then we were walking toward the Umschlagplatz in walls of fire from both sides. They burned the buildings. They told if you don't come out within half an hour, we're going to burn you down. And they burned the buildings. As soon as they finished a half an hour, they would burn all the buildings. So we were walking in walls of fire to the Umschlagplatz. When we arrived in the Umschlagplatz, it was an old Jewish school in their little rooms. They chased us up into these rooms, as many as people as possible. We were there for about that day, that night, and the following day towards the evening. And no food, no water, you couldn't go out. So women with children and everybody, you can imagine all your ablutions, everything you had to do there. The Ukrainians were standing and guarding us. If you tried to get out, they would kill you. And if you gave them something of value, they would give you a bottle of water. My father, I saw him take off the ring from my mother's, wedding ring. And he went to the door and he got a bottle of water. He had a sock of sugar with a teaspoon. And he gave his children, a teaspoon of sugar and a little bit of water. They never touched it. And then we were chased into the wagons and we got to Majdanek. We didn't know. We thought that we were going to Treblinka because everybody knew about Treblinka within 6 weeks or even before in the Warsaw Ghetto. When we arrived in Majdanek, which I didn't know it was Majdanek, nobody knew where we were. We arrived when we got off the station, it was dark, but people said it's Lublin. And then they made us walk into the camp, and then we were standing there waiting. They separated men from women, women with children, women without children, children on their own. And my father said to me, you must say you are 5 years older or 6 years older. I was 11 at the time, and he said, you must say you are 16. And the documents that I've got today from the Germans, because, I was then, a slave laborer, I was born in 1927 instead of 1932. And my sister was separated from my mother. And then I saw her running towards my mother. I was watching my mother and she hugged her. She had this big blonde braid. And since that time, everything about my sister, who I lived together with 11 years, I forgot. All I remember when I think of Sabina, her name, a Yiddish name was Shifrotrano, I only see the braid. That's all I see. I can't see anything of her. I can't remember anything. We lived together when we were babies. We were sleeping in the same room. And I remember my part of it, but I don't remember her part of it. And then they took away the women and we were standing there for quite a long time. And I don't even remember how long. And then they chased us to the barrack and they made us undress naked, also with our hands up in the air, and they chased us. There was a man with a white coat and a little stick and pushing people right, left, right, left, right, left. And I started saying, I got into a room and I saw shower heads. And in the ghetto, they told us that if you see shower heads, gas is going to come out. No water comes out, trying to fool you. So I started saying my prayers too, because I was waiting to die. And water came out in my case. And I was chased into another barrack, and then I was given these striped clothes and wooden clogs, and I was chased out chased out. And I started looking for my father, because I said, if I'm alive, my mother, my sister, and my father must be alive. We weren't killed. And I started running around, and I found a man who used to come at night and sleep. My father used to bring a lot of people to sleep in the little kitchen at night. And I found one of these men, and I asked him, did you see my father? Where's my father? Where's my father? And he wouldn't answer. He pushed me away. Eventually, he just lifted his eyes to heaven. And I didn't know what he meant, but I knew when the Jew lifts his eyes to heaven, it can't be very good. And then there was a roll call, and then we were chased into a barrack for the night, given no food, no nothing. And then the next morning, I was told exactly what is happening in Majdanek. And I was told by other people, and I knew that both my father and my mother and my sister were murdered the day we arrived in Majdanek.
Pinchas, I first of all want to share with you, there's so many people writing in the chat right now. Everyone, including myself, want to thank you for sharing your testimony. I think together with Havi Dreifuss, your personal testimony, we have a much broader, deeper, more painful understanding of what we're actually doing this program about. I know that some of your family is here with you as well, and I want to say thank you for having your family here with us. And there are other families of survivors that are asking questions. For example, if maybe your family knew their family, I'll send those questions to you by email. I know that you wanted to end your testimony with something special. So I want to give you an opportunity, if you are ready and you feel that you can do that, to share your song with us.
Well, in memory of what happened, one night I woke up and some words I must have heard in the concentration camp, but I composed a song about the Umschlagplatz and Treblinka, and the melody, I did it all by myself, and I translated it even into English. And I'm not a scholar. I never went to school. I finished school when I was like 8 years old in Poland before the war. But somehow or other, this inspiration came, and I would like to sing it to you, but I always sing it in Yiddish. So I'm going to sing it now, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. You know, I'm very emotional at the moment, but I hope that I will be able to sing it. Dort nicht weit, dort wie der Umschlagplatz dort steigt, dort wie man stippt sich in der Brei, in die Waggonen. Dort wie ein Kind streit zu der Mammen, oi Mama, lass mich nicht allein, ich will gehen mit dir zusammen. Schweig, Kinderle, schweig, Herzele, sag nicht euch, als du bist ein, weil Brüder, Schwester, Tate, Mammen, fuhren alle zusammen, fuhren alle zu versammen. Schweig, Kinderle, schweig, Herzele, sag nicht euch, als du bist ein. Die Polizei, sie hat geheißen, schneller gehen. Ihr werdet da kommen, ihr werdet da kommen. Die Polizei, sie hat geheißen, schneller gehen. Ihr werdet nicht wissen, von kein Neu. Bekommen 3 Kilo Bräu. Und mit dem Bräu hat man sei geschickt in Teu. Seid wollen nicht mehr zurückkommen. Schweig, Kinderle, schweig, Herzele, sag nicht euch, als du bist ein Jid, weil Brüder, Schwester, Tate, Mammen, fuhren alle zusammen, fuhren alle zu versammen. Schweig, Kinderle, schweig, Herzele, sag nicht euch, als du bist ein Jid. Treblinka dort, das ist aus Jiddisch getauft. Wer kommt dahin, verbleibt schon dort, wird wer zurückkommen. Dort wie ein Kind schreit zu der Mama, oi Mama, lass mich nicht allein, ich will gehen mit dir zusammen. Schweig, Kinder, schweig, Herzele, sag nicht euch, als du bist ein, weil Brüder, Schwester, Tate, Mammen, fuhren alle zusammen, fuhren alle zu versammen. Schweig, Kinder, schweig, Herzele, sag nicht euch, als du bist ein.
Pinchas, toda. Thank you so much for sharing your music and your memories and your story I think we are all, as someone wrote, touched beyond words. And I have to say that I am with them. It's hard to find the words. We want to thank you for your strength. And I want to remind everybody that Pinchas just celebrated his 90th birthday. So I want everyone to join me in wishing him a mazal tov and good health, and to continue to give testimony. I also want to thank again Havi Dreifuss, dear friend of the Ghetto Fighters House, who has always brought so much knowledge, even through the pain, to help us to better understand what happened to the Jewish community, in this case, in the Warsaw Ghetto. And we'll continue to talk about this very difficult subject over the next 2 months, and hopefully you will join us. I want to thank all our partners as well, and Igal Cohen, our captain, who leads these programs, and thank our audience for coming to be with us, to share and listen to these stories, to, as someone wrote, be a witness to the witness, and to give us a lot of support. So I want to thank everyone for that as well, and wish everyone a good day, wherever you are. For me, it's good night, good morning, good afternoon, and we will see you all on August 21st. Thank you.
Toda rabba. Shalom.
Toda. Toda, Pinchas.
Thank you, dear Pinchas. Thank you from all of us.
I think the way you spoke about Warsaw Ghetto, it reminded me the first time I went back to Warsaw and I visited the Historical Institute, and I saw some of the pictures which reminded me of what I saw myself in the ghetto, and I started shaking and shivering, and my wife was hugging me and I was crying, and I ran out. I said, I can't stand in this place because it's so, and you, the way sometimes people talk about the professional, academics, which is very important. Academics must teach, but sometimes they speak and it's like something dry. But the way you explained these things and the emotions that you gave it with, it actually made me shiver inside. It was the same thing. I felt as I was there in the Warsaw Ghetto and listening to somebody who actually kind of could depict it in such a way which was quite extraordinary.
Thank you.
I really want to thank you.
We all, when we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto or other things, we all rely on you, on survivors, on people who wrote during the Holocaust. It's everything, the things that you are telling, and your testimony is so important. And I'm grateful for, I listened to the few testimonies that you gave, but each time, and today again, I learned new things, and I'm grateful for each and every sentence that you said. Thank you, Pinchas.
תודה רבה. שלום לכולכם וברכה, ואני מתכוון לשמוע אותך שוב ב-21.
הלוואי, זכות שלי. בריאות טובה, בריאות טובה.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for doing it.
On that wonderful note in Hebrew, I want to say Shalom.